On a windless night beneath the slanted roof tiles of a modest Taoist hermitage, the furnace breathed like a sleeping animal. Bellow, glow, hush, the cycle of breath in iron and clay. Outside, plum blossoms opened under frost, their pale faces trembling with a scent so clean and light it seemed to ring in the air. No stars were visible. The moon hid itself like a kept promise. Within the workshop, a man named Lin Wei knelt on woven reed mats and counted his heartbeats to steady his hands. He had always believed that change began as a particle, smaller than dust, a seed of heat, a thought of the cosmos held behind the teeth of the mind. He would tell himself that nothing truly ends. It only sheds its signature and takes another wood becomes smoke. Smoke becomes cloud. Cloud feeds rain. Rain writes rivers. Tonight, he was searching for a door between signatures, a narrow seam in the fabric where mortal breath might be taller than its fate. Lin Wei was neither famous nor obscure in the way that priests and physicians often are. He was simply the kind of man that dynasties depend upon without knowing it, the quiet worker of small, faithful experiments. He had learned under an old master who claimed discipleship to a lineage that reached into mist and myth. Some named Wei Boyang the father of alchemy, a mouth of legend through which choirs of anonymous hands spoke. Lin Wei understood the truth buried inside the story. Knowledge is a river braided by many streams. A single name is only a cup dipped into a flood. It was not war that guided his hands. It was medicine, or what passed for medicine when the question is age and its fallible edges. They called it fire medicine, Wo Yao, a phrase that made him feel both humble and uneasy. Medicine brings healing, fire brings hunger. He thought perhaps the world harmonized opposites just to remind men how little they knew. The manuscript he kept near his elbow warned as much. Some have heated together sulphur, realgar, and saltpeter with honey. Smoke and flames result so that their hands and faces have been burnt, and even the whole house burned down. He traced the lines with a fingertip the way one checks the grain in wood, feeling the admonition settle in his bones like a second spine. Fire medicine, not the elixir. A door that does not open where you think it does. When the mixture took, the air changed. The hearth seemed to lean in. He stepped back and closed his eyes. The floor hummed underfoot with a rumour of thunder. He had prepared vents, sand, a damp cloth. He had also prepared, without admitting it, a thought of failure gentle enough to live with. The sound that came was neither explosion nor whisper, but a long, astonished exhalation. Like a deity waking. The flame did not bloom, it leapt. The small clay lid shuddered and clattered onto its side. Smoke braided upward in a quick black rope, and burning stars shot outward, sharp as thrown rice on a wedding day gone awry. He did not move until the last grain died. Then he sat. Then he wept. The next morning he swept the ash as if collecting a scattered prayer. The workshop lived, his hands spared, his eyebrows scorched. The smell of sulphur haunted his robe and hair. The plum blossoms outside had shaken down a small snow of white in the night. The path was powdered like a spirit road. He stood in it and felt the odd buoyancy that follows a disaster narrowly averted. Relief, yes, but also the bloom of question. What is this thing? He wrote to his teacher in the city and did not send the letter. Then he wrote to a physician he respected and did not send that letter either. Finally he wrote a page for the Hermitage archive, the quiet box of papers that no one reads until someone has already died. He described the proportions and then crossed them out. He described the behaviour of flame and kept that. He wrote, "This is not the elixir of life," and left it. At noon, a courier came with a message. The capital stirred. Borders trembled. Fortunes were a set of lacquer boxes being stacked and unstacked by unseen hands. Lin Wei read the brushstrokes and felt his own brush lifted out of his fingers by the wind of events. Taoist alchemists had patrons. Patrons had armies. Armies had appetites that could eat an empire and call it sacrament. He swept his floor again and understood that to keep a thing secret is also to build it a shrine. Secrets require offerings, and offerings are never free. Her name was Yinqing. She did not give it first. Instead, she gave questions. Why do you grind willow more finely than pine? Why do you cool the crucible with damp cloth and not with breath? Why do you weigh saltpetre as if it were heavier than it is? He answered her by asking her to sweep, to watch, to listen. Apprenticeship is a language taught between gestures. Her hands were quick and kind. She did not fear the furnace. She feared her own impatience. When the day came that he let her hold the mixing bowl, she treated it as if it had been a bird with a broken neck, gentle, but firm enough to keep it from the final surrender. He saw in her a bright severity that made him hopeful and uncertain. The Tao favoured balance. She favoured the knife edge where balance bled into insistence. One evening she said, "Master Lin, why do we call a thing medicine if it yearns to burn?" He thought of the old texts that had drifted down the centuries like autumn leaves whose veins were equations. He thought of the warning about houses burning. He thought of purple flames that revealed saltpeter's truth. He said, "Because the illness it heals is ignorance of the world's appetite." "Ours," he said, "and then, if we are uncareful, everyone's." There were manuscripts that haunted their table like polite ghosts. The old masters, anonymous and named, the warnings and recipes, the early proportions that read like dreams described in daylight. In one, a formula with sulphur and saltpeter and an herb, then revised in another text a generation later, then banned by admonition in a third. To read the history was to watch the human mind test gates in a garden wall, and sometimes slip through. Lin Wei and Yinqing spoke of immortality not as an antidote to death, but as a mispronunciation of time. Perhaps the sage who lived well didn't live longer, only wider. Perhaps the elixir lay not in the blood, but in the arrangement of meaning. What if to truly cure the emperor's fear, one had to cure the empire's dream? At night, when the plum tree sounded like paper turning, Lin Wei would lie awake and consider a possibility he pretended not to cherish, that this thing could be shaped into more than bright astonishment, a fuse, controlled, a vessel, sealed, an arrow fitted with fire not as decoration but as hunger that travels. The idea came to him as calmly as rain that has always been scheduled. They began small, cloth-wrapped slivers of the powder tied to a reed and lit, the flame moving along a wick that counted slowly to the leap. The first attempts were comedy and sorrow. The reed fizzed and died. The cloth flared and sighed. An ember burned a hole through Lin Wei's sleeve and into the small grief beneath. He laughed like a man scolded by his own future. Then one night the workshop tasted lightning. The wick burned down, the powder breathed, the reed shrieked and leapt across the room with a rage that was almost music, and slammed into a clay target set there precisely to be struck. The clay split, the room filled with the smell of victory and its aftertaste fear. Yinqing stood with the charred reed in her hands like a branch pulled from a river. "It wants to fly," she said quietly, "not to burn where it was born." They began to write in a different tone. Notated lengths of wicks, described casings and the patience required to let the paste bind powders into loyal companionship. They discovered that a certain proportion made noise like thunder in a small jar, another made more heat than roar. They discovered that strength lived not in the powder alone, but in the contract between powder and vessel, the agreement to hold breath until the world could not bear it. They came in autumn, officials with faces like lacquer polite, reflective and built to hide wood. Their seals hung like small suns. They addressed Lin Wei with courtesy that felt weighed. News had been travelling the way smoke does, through rafters, across worship, into lungs, fire medicine, results, warnings. The city breathed with drums whose rhythms the hermitage could not ignore. "We've heard that you have achieved a refinement in the composition of Huo Yao," the eldest said, voice smooth. "We serve a court that seeks to strengthen the walls that keep peace. We would learn what you have learned." Lin Wei poured tea slowly. Yinqing watched steam write briefly on air. "Huo Yao is not a wall," Lin Wei said. "It is a question." They arranged demonstrations in a courtyard borrowed from a monastery that pretended at indifference. Clay bombs sealed with care were set upon the ground and lit at a distance with a slow wick. The officials stood back. Monks stood further. When the first thunder came, birds wrote panic across the sky, and the officials' faces moved at last, the lacquer cracking to show the wood beneath fear, then calculation, then appetite. "This is a roar the enemy will hear in their blood," the eldest said. "And arrows, you say?" "Arrows that carry fire," Yinqing said, and there was no triumph in her voice, only sorrow that knowledge insisted upon its own growth. There is a moment in every invention where it ceases to belong to the inventor. It sheds the skin of solitude and assumes the carapace of history. Lin Wei felt that shedding as one feels an earthquake in the bowls on a shelf. It was not yet destruction, it was the certainty that arrangement would be rearranged. They were offered positions, consultancies disguised as vows. They were asked for recipes and they gave cautions. They were asked for proportions and they gave ranges. The court wanted clocks. The alchemists spoke of weather. Even so, what was shared was enough. A paper moves from desk to desk and becomes a scaffold. A scaffold attracts workers. Workers build the thing that paper dreamt, and then that thing dreams of more. Yinqing learned to make fuses that counted true. Lin Wei learned to make containers that did not surrender early. Together they learned what power does to the hand that holds it. It makes it tremble in a way that feels like purpose. They would sit in the courtyard after demonstrations and watch the monks repair what the thunder had undone, sweep tiles, soothe birds, gather shards. "Does knowledge make us righteous?" Yinqing asked. "It makes us responsible," Lin Wei said. "Righteousness is a costume that does not fit for long." "If the Empire uses this to burn, are we the spark or the wind?" "Both," he said, and wished the answer had been neither. He returned to the manuscripts that had warned of faces burned and houses destroyed, and understood the mercy inside those alarms. They were the ancestors' way of whispering, "You cannot unknow this, so learn how to carry it without breaking everything you touch." News rides faster than horses when it wears the boots of rumour. There was a border fortress that had long been a tooth in the jaw of the frontier. It was tested. Arrows with fire were loosed. Clay spheres that carried thunder were hurled from machines whose ropes sang like plucked nerves. The night wore new stars that fell and argued with that wood. Reports returned wrapped in triumph and smoke. The enemy fled, it was said. The walls held, it was said. The border quieted in the special way a beaten dog quiets, watchful, measuring distance. The court whispered that the alchemists had provided medicine that cured fear. Lin Wei read those lines and felt the undertow. A cure that requires more and more of itself ceases to be a cure and becomes a diet of endless hunger. He looked at her and saw a reflection, what he would have said when his knees were younger. Stop what? Feeding the appetite of those who count killing as an answer. "We feed the appetite of knowledge," he said weakly, and heard in his voice the excuse that keeps the wheels greased. She sat beside him, and they listened to the courtyard's small noises, the lizard stitching the wall with tiny feet, the wind tugging at prayer flags that had once meant nothing to him, and now meant everything. "I don't want the world to be smaller because of what we've done," she said. "It will be larger," he said, "but it may be sharper." "That is not comfort," she said. "No," he agreed. "It is a warning." At last the old teacher wrote a letter folded as carefully as a fan. It named neither court nor siege. It spoke instead of plum blossoms and the correct way to brew tea when guests have travelled far. The last paragraph touched the true matter, as if its heat could burn paper. "You have followed the river as it chose its own bed," the teacher wrote. "No river apologizes for its gorge. Yet a river may be guided. Build banks, plant trees, curve where a village sleeps. Your discovery is a music that can be sung as lullaby or as drum. Choose your listeners when you can. When you cannot, play with humility. Fire medicine is not the elixir. It is a mirror. Those who look into it will see what they already are. Lin Wei read it aloud to Yin Qing. They did not speak for a long time. There came a time when officials asked not gently for a complete treatise. The impulse to codify is the empire's shadow. Lin Wei and Yin Qing wrote, because to refuse would be to vanish in a way that helps nothing. But what they wrote was not a single recipe. It was a garden of cautions. They included principles rather than certainties. They wrote of humidity and charcoal's moods. They wrote of saltpeter's purple confession in flame. They wrote of proportion bands that sang in different keys. They wrote of containers as ethics, how much you hold, how long, and why. They described fuses as time made visible. They drew arrows that flew as parables and jars that thundered as sermons. They described the labour of drying, the patience of sifting, the humility of cleaning one's bench as the first act of safety and the last. The court accepted the document and called it satisfactory in the bland tone of victory. The work moved to other hands and other rooms, where men who wore armour instead of aprons learned to feel confidence when they smelled sulphur. There was an accident, because there are always accidents. A warehouse near the river where soldiers had been instructed to respect powders, as one respects elders grudgingly. Moisture had crept into barrels like a thief, and then left in sun, leaving clumps that looked docile but hid resentment. A spark climbed a ladder of mistake. The thunder that followed snapped the spine of the neighbourhood. Clay became gravel. Roofs knelt. The river itself seemed to flinch. Lin Wei and Yin Qing were summoned, not as suspects, but as physicians called to a plague. They moved through ash that had buried names. They touched the burnt with cloth soaked in humility. They said to officials who had learned to split hair with their tongues, "This is not a tool for fools." "Then make us wise," the officials said. "Wisdom costs more than coin," Yin Qing said, and did not add what coin was being counted in that hour. In quiet hours, Lin Wei considered the superstition of firstness. The world loves a myth of the single spark, the lone mind, the inaugural footstep on a blank shore. It is easier to worship a statue than to tend a forest. The texts crowded the centuries behind him, whispering of earlier hands that had mixed, tested, warned. Some formulas older than his bones. The thunder carried names that did not carry bodies. Was he the first? No. Was he the door? Perhaps he was a hinge. He decided that being first is a vanity and a burden both. Every discovery is a braid of patience, accident, prayer, and hunger. What mattered now was not the order in which the torches were lit, but how the light would be used. New Year came with lanterns braided in red, and firecrackers rattled like hail on roof tiles. Noises warred, Noise's invitation to fortune. Children covered their ears and laughed through their fingers. Elders pretended annoyance and glowed. Lin Wei stood among them and felt a strange double vision, delight at the harmless roar and grief for the roars that would not be harmless. Yin Qing slipped him a small paper packet. "Celebrate," she said. "If we must be companions to thunder, let us also be kin to joy." They lit a string, and the night applauded itself. For a moment the world held the possibility that noise could be only celebration. For a moment the powder remembered it had been called medicine. Years later, rumours came with sailors who smelled of salt and hunger. The powder had travelled, as ideas do, wearing new names and making new promises, across borders, across mountains, arrows in other skies, jars in other courtyards, thunder in other languages. It is the fate of fire to teach every house its own caution. Lin Wei kept his workshop neat and his afternoons slow. He taught the next people to sweep twice and to listen to colour. He taught them to fear pride more than flame. He taught them to write warnings in large script and recipes in small. Yinsing taught them to say no to those whose eyes turned to weapons when they smelled sulphur. They were not always believed. They were always heard. When he died, a quiet death, winged by age, Yinqing burned his robe in the courtyard and mixed the ash with water and painted a single character on the wall: listen. A military manual appeared in the world with formulas that felt like familiarity seen through another window, proportions that balanced breath and flame, lists of ingredients that named the same old friends with new insistence, methods for binding the powders into purposes as varied as noise and harm. The river had reached a new country and learned the language there. Lin Wei, already a name spoken softly by few, did not grimace from wherever the dead weather they're remembering. He had always known that knowledge walked on many legs. He had always suspected that thunder wanted to be taught. He only hoped that those who taught it would also teach a little mercy.